Okay, so, you sent this over to us, Bishop Mar Emmanuel's sermon, How to Spot Demons in Friends and Family. And right away, it's like, whoa, this is going to be a delicate one.
It is a sensitive topic for sure. And I think for this deep dive, the idea is to really kind of try to carefully go through and see what he's getting at. What are the central ideas that he's presenting in this sermon about how someone might recognize or discern what he describes as, these negative spiritual influences affecting people they love.
And I think it's so important, right at the top here for us to say that, we are not, we're not here to provide any personal diagnoses or anything like that, and certainly no judgments from us. We're just trying to understand, his viewpoint in this one piece of work about, this very complex area.
Right. And, what's interesting about the sermon is it really does paint this picture of a spiritual battle going on. And he believes this is happening in a realm we don't see, but it's impacting, our relationships and our hearts and, the inner lives of those around us. And it's within that kind of framework that he lays out these signs.
Yeah. And so, one of the first major themes that he goes into is this idea of a noticeable shift in someone's character and morality. Right. And, he starts by talking about these kind of subtle changes that you might observe in someone close to you, like a friend or family member. And he talks about, a dimming of their warmth or a sharpness in their words. And then this kind of gradual erosion of, values that they once held dear, like morality and honesty and integrity.
Right. And what's interesting is he really highlights how gradual it is.
Yeah.
It's like this slow poison that kind of numbs the conscience over time. And it's not like a sudden flip of a switch.
Yeah, it's not an overnight change. It's this subtle creep.
Exactly. And it's interesting because that aligns with, a lot of what we understand about how people's personalities and values can change over time.
Yeah.
It's this idea of moral drift. Mm-hmm. Small incremental changes can lead to significant shifts.
It is, isn't it? And he ties this into, the idea of people starting to excuse sin and justify things they once called wrong.
Right.
Like those little cracks in the foundation.
Right. And it's almost like they surround themselves with people who also kind of encourage those, rationalizations.
Yeah, it's like an echo chamber effect, but for negativity.
Right, exactly.
And what's really deceptive is, is that a lot of times this is presented not as a, decline or anything negative. It's presented as freedom.
Right, living your truth.
Authenticity.
Yeah, and it's interesting how, what one person might see as liberation, another person might look at it and say I don't know about that.
It's all about perspective, right?
Right, exactly.
And his advice is, isn't to just sit back and watch this happen. He talks about, the importance of praying for the person and speaking truth in love, as he puts it.
Right, and it's interesting that he emphasizes that because it seems like the underlying belief is that this isn't just a matter of someone's personal choices, whatever. It's there's an actual spiritual influence at play.
There's something deeper going on.
Right, and so the response has to be on that level too.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about another, major indicator that he talks about, the presence of division and strife.
Right.
And he describes this as a primary tool of the enemy, and it leads to things like, constant conflict, broken relationships, bitter argument.
It's like that classic divide and conquer strategy.
It is, and and he talks about how it can start in such subtle ways, like a friend who was once peaceful, now they're stirring up drama, or, words become like weapons they're meant to wound.
Right. Or that gossip spreading misinformation, trying to plant seeds of doubt. It's you see this online all the time, how quickly a disagreement can spiral out of control.
It's like a wildfire.
Right, exactly.
And he even talks about, it progresses from those subtle jabs to more aggressive things. Did you hear what so-and-so said about you?
Right, it's like trying to actively create distrust and suspicion.
Yeah, and the outcome of all this, is that you have people who are easily offended, they're unwilling to forgive, holding grudges.
Right, it's a toxic environment.
Yeah, and here's the scary part. Those who are actively contributing to this division, they often believe they're in the right.
Right, they're convinced they're the good guys.
They think they're fighting for justice or something.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what's so insidious about this kind of influence, they don't even realize the harm they're causing.
Yeah, so what's the antidote to this? What does he suggest? Well, he really emphasizes confronting this division with love and truth. Yep. It's about refusing to participate in the gossip, striving to be a peacemaker.
Be the bigger person.
Right. And of course, prayer, he always brings it back to that.
Yeah, and he makes this really interesting point. He says that the enemy's greatest fear is unity.
Right. So if division is the goal, then unity is the opposite.
The counterforce.
Exactly. Okay, so another sign he talks about, and this is a strong one, he calls it a hatred for truth.
Right.
I mean, that's a pretty intense statement.
It is. And what he means by that is this deep resistance to anything that carries the light of God. You know, he gives examples like scoffing at the word of God, rejecting correction with anger, you know, just a general hostility towards righteousness.
So it's more than just like disagreeing with something. It's like an active revulsion.
Right. It's a visceral reaction.
Yeah. And he does make a distinction between, you know, someone who's genuinely seeking to understand different viewpoints and someone who's just like outright rejecting any kind of truth that doesn't align with their own.
Right. It's about the intention in the approach.
Yeah.
You know, someone who's genuinely seeking understanding might ask questions, express their doubts respectfully, but someone who has this hatred for truth, they're just going to shut down any conversation that challenges their worldview.
Yeah, and he talks about how in their minds, you know, truth gets twisted, you know, good is called evil, and, you know, truth is seen as like relative or oppressive or whatever.
Right, it's like a complete inversion.
It is, and this extends to how they treat people who do hold on to, you know, traditional values or beliefs. You know, he says they'll accuse them of being judgmental or narrow-minded or intolerant.
Right, it's like that classic ad hominem attack. You know, discredit the person instead of addressing the argument.
Exactly. And he offers this explanation for this hatred. He says that truth exposes darkness. And so for someone who's aligned themselves with darkness, truth feels like a threat.
Yeah, it's like shining a light on something they want to keep hidden.
Right. And he says the enemy, you know, is working to fill their minds with lies, you know, telling them they don't need God or that sin has no consequences.
Right, so they become desensitized to those things.
Yeah. And he says all this leads to a hardened heart and a lack of conviction.
Right. If you don't believe in any kind of objective truth, then it's easier to justify your actions. You know, there's no guilt or remorse.
Yeah. So what's the approach here? You know, how do you deal with someone who exhibits this hatred for truth?
Well, he emphasizes prayer.
Yeah.
You know, and avoiding arguments that are just going to go nowhere and continuing to speak the truth in love, even if it's not received well.
And patience.
Lots of patience.
Yeah. Because
it's a process.
It is. It's not going to change overnight.
Okay, so let's talk about another sign that's a little more, you know, maybe readily apparent in everyday interactions.
Yeah.
He calls it coldness and lack of love.
Right.
And he talks about, you know, these visible signs like a distant demeanor and an indifferent attitude, you know, a hardened heart.
Right, a lack of warmth and compassion in their words and actions.
Yeah, and he says this is like a slow erosion of love, you know, which he sees as diminishing the essence of God within a person. Right, the idea is that love is like this fundamental spiritual attribute, and its absence is a serious sign.
And he gives these very specific examples of how this might look, you know, like a lack of concern for others' suffering and increase in selfishness, you know, just apathy where there used to be empathy.
Right, it's like a chilling indifference.
Yeah, and he connects this absence of love to, you know, more negative behaviors like cruelty, manipulation, using others.
Right, because without that fundamental care for other people, it's easier to justify those actions.
Yeah, and he says often this coldness is accompanied by pride, like a sense of superiority over others.
Right, they see themselves as above it all.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is he says that the person might not even realize this is happening to them.
Right, they might think this is just who they are now. You know, a new and improved version of themselves.
Like they've evolved or something.
Right, exactly.
But he's very clear that this lack of love is a form of bondage, you know, that leads to emptiness.
Right, it's like a spiritual void that can't be filled with anything external.
Yeah, so what do you do when you see this in someone you care about?
Well, he talks about the importance of continuing to show them love, even when it's rejected, praying for them, reminding them of the power of love.
Yeah, like trying to rekindle that flame.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so the final sign we want to talk about from his sermon is an attraction to darkness.
Right.
And he says this is often a gradual thing, starting with what might seem like small compromises or harmless curiosities.
Right, and he's specific about the kinds of things he's talking about, you know, like an increasing fascination with things that are morbid or twisted or disturbing.
Like in entertainment, for example.
Right, like movies or music or books that glorify violence or chaos or, you know, just negative themes in general.
Yeah, or he also mentions, you know, an interest in the occult, like tarot cards or astrology or witchcraft.
Right, these things that claim to offer power or knowledge outside of, you know, traditional religion.
And his concern is that, you know, this isn't just a passing phase. It can actually become a way of thinking.
Right, it can start to shape their worldview.
And he says, this can lead to rationalizing sin, rejecting authority, even rebelling against God.
Right, and there's often this mocking attitude towards people who still believe in, goodness and righteousness.
Yeah, it's like they've completely flipped the script.
Right, they've rejected their former values.
And he's very clear about the dangers here. He says that inviting darkness into your life can open spiritual doors that should never be opened.
Right, and he talks about the potential consequences like increased anger, depression, restlessness, emptiness.
Like a spiritual heaviness.
Right, exactly.
So what's the approach here? How do you help someone who's going down this path?
Well, he emphasizes prayer. Again, of course, and also, engaging in spiritual warfare, not in the sense of arguing with them, but, praying for their deliverance.
Yeah, and standing firm in your own faith, being a beacon of light.
Right, and reminding them that redemption is always possible.
Always a way back.
Exactly.
So he concludes the sermon by summarizing, these key signs: deception, division, rebellion, the erosion of love and truth. And he makes it very clear that this is a spiritual battle. And it needs to be fought with light and with faith.
Right. He talks about the power of prayer, the importance of standing firm in your beliefs, and the belief that no one is beyond redemption.
And he even offers a prayer at the end, specifically focused on these things.
Right. Praying for discernment, for courage, for softened hearts, for reconciliation.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff.
It is.
Yeah.
And, it's a message that, despite all the warnings about these negative influences, ultimately offers hope.
Yeah, there's always hope.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to reiterate that this is just one perspective. This is Bishop Emmanuel's viewpoint on this topic.
Right. And it's important to think critically, to consider other perspectives as well.
Absolutely. And, it really does make you think about, this idea of unseen influences, doesn't it? And even if you don't fully subscribe to the spiritual interpretation, do any of these behavioral patterns resonate with you? Have you seen these things in your own relationships or in your community?
Right. It's definitely food for thought.
Yeah. And, what stood out